Whitley, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join me this evening. I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it too.
When your experiences with the visitors began in December of 1985, it was while you were at your remote cabin in the Hudson Valley area of New York State. Now, at the time, the Hudson Valley was in the middle of a UFO flap, which many witnesses, starting in 1983, reported seeing what became known as the Westchester Boomerang. Before your experiences, were you aware of the Hudson Valley area being a hotspot for UFO activity?
No, I was not aware of it in any way whatsoever. I had been interested in the subject of UFOs when I was a child, but I was not a child anymore. So it really didn't have any significance for me. And I was not aware of what was going on in the Hudson Valley, which was 30 miles actually east of where we were. We were in Ulster County on the other side of the Hudson River, but obviously if it's a UFO, it can cross the Hudson River fairly easily. That never happened. We didn't see a thing. In fact, I didn't see one until I woke up in one.
Oh my goodness. And you mentioned that you were interested in UFOs as a kid. What sparked that interest?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, I was a kid so long ago that it might be hard for some of you guys to believe that time even existed. That was in the 50s. And there were a lot of UFO stories in the news in those days. In those days, the Air Force investigated them seriously. And one of my best friend's father was involved in something that has become known as the Levelland, Texas UFO incident, where a UFO came low to the ground and was seen by a lot of people and caused their cars to stop. And his was one of the cars that stopped. And so we boys we ate this stuff up. We were really fascinated. But you grow up, you go to high school, you go to college, you basically forget about all that stuff. And so when I was 40 years old, I hadn't thought about UFOs since I was a boy. I mean, I hadn't thought about them since I was about 13 or 14. And then suddenly this happened. And really, I mean, you talk about change of life, changed my life.
Well, I've got to admit, some of the scenes depicting your abductions in the movie really gave me frightening nightmares back when I was in high school. And for me, the biggest aspect of that wasn't the appearances of the visitors, but rather the lack of control over your situation as things were occurring during the abductions. Can I ask if you had to put your finger on the most unnerving aspect to all of it back then? Was it more of facing the visitors or the helplessness of not being in control or something else entirely?
Yeah, it was the whole thing. I wasn't really aware of any of those specifics. All I knew was I had waked up in a room full of what looked to me like gigantic insects, unless I had become extremely small, which I didn't think so. And I couldn't make the nightmare stop. It was a very, very bizarre experience. Because you have a nightmare like that, and you want to wake up and be in your bed. Only it didn't help. And then to make matters much worse, this voice started saying, "What can we do to help you stop screaming?" over and over again. I hadn't been aware of the fact that I was screaming, but I'm sure I was. And the voice was very gentle and sort of vaguely feminine, but totally mechanical at the same time. And it made things much more real. And that was extremely distressing. I never felt so helpless in my life.
For those that haven't read your books or seen the movie, how would you describe how these visitors looked?
Well, I remember them very vividly. In fact, let me just reach over here and get something. this is how they looked. This is the original communion portrait from the cover of the book. And the big eyes, I don't know if the rest of the face is right, but those big black eyes were very startling indeed. And they were glaring right at me. I mean, they were a couple of feet away from my face. And then there were these others that were dark blue and wore sort of clothes that had a lot of flaps and things on them. They looked like workers. They were there too. And it was beyond bizarre. I mean, to this day, if you asked me if they were aliens, I would tell you, I don't know what they were, because nobody's ever shown me a planet that they came from or anything like that. I don't know what they were, but boy, I mean, they were powerful. They overcame me completely. I couldn't do anything.
Going back to the Hudson Valley area, it's still an active and prominent zone for UFO sightings, and the activity seems to go through spikes from time to time. Have you any thoughts on why this area specifically is such a focus for sightings?
Well, what I know about my specific area, not the Hudson Valley, but where I am, it's a very unusual geologic formation. There's a huge seam of iron under the ground there that goes right actually under my house, and starts about 20 miles south of the house and goes to about 30 miles north of the house. And the Iron Mountain storage facility where they store sensitive records is drilled into that north of where I live. It's not near my house, and then at the southern end of it, there's a road called Magnetic Mine Road, where they often see lights, balls of light floating along, sort of like the Marfa lights in Texas. So there's something weird about the area, something a little bit different, a little off. And maybe that has something to do with it. As far as the geology of the Hudson Valley itself, where all of those sightings occurred, I don't know much about it, but I do know that these are the unusual things about my area.
Your book, Communion, was published in 1987. So at what point in the timeline of events did you decide to chronicle what was happening to you? And what was the ultimate trigger to make you want to reveal to the world what was going on?
Well, I had a situation where I was very disturbed by what happened, very disturbed by it. And I didn't initially occur to me that it had anything whatsoever to do with aliens. What I was concerned about was that I had been somehow assaulted, because, to be perfectly blunt, I was raped. A needle was put into the side of my head, and I was beat up. I mean, definitely something had happened to me, only I had a lot of trouble understanding it because the memories were so bizarre. I went to the doctor, and he confirmed that I had been injured. The injuries were there and visible. And then he asked me to describe what happened. And I proceeded to describe the experience as I then remembered it. And he said, "It sounds like you're telling me you were taken aboard a flying saucer by little men." I said, "God, Tom, that what it sounds like." And he said, "Well, let's do some work. Let's do an MRI scan on your brain. Let's do a test for a temporal lobe epilepsy. Let's do some psychological tests and see where we are here." Because neither one of us thought for a minute that was really what happened. I mean, who would think that? So I did all the tests and came back normal in every respect. And I was just appalled. I thought then it had been criminal activity, that someone had assaulted me and maybe somehow gotten LSD or something into me, because I was a fairly well-known writer, and things happen to people. And, there's a lot of weirdos in the world. There were then as there are now. And, we were living alone in the country. We had no alarm system or anything. We didn't think we needed one. Maybe I had been assaulted by some crazy person or something. But then I read a book my brother had sent me for Christmas called Science and the UFOs, which is, I hadn't read it because I opened it and I thought, oh no, I'm talking about a bad Christmas present. So I just sort of ignored it. But then I thought, well, they look like aliens. And this is a scientific book. Maybe it's something rational in it. And I was appalled to find some material that was just like what had happened to me.
When was that book written?
Science and the UFOs, probably in the mid 80s, early 80s. I don't know. It was an English book by a woman named Jenny Randalls. And it mentioned a man called Bud Hopkins in New York, who lived in New York. And he helped people who had this experience. And so I thought, well, I'll call him. And I did call him. And my wife and I went to see him. And it was all seemed rather absurd to us because we thought, here was a guy who implicitly believed this was contact with aliens and they were awful and they were raping us and doing all kinds of things, which was all true. I mean, that's exactly what happened to me. But I didn't have much faith in him, to be honest. Then he says, well, I want to hypnotize you. I thought, oh, no, that's not going to happen. So he proceeds to get the best forensic hypnotist probably in the United States involved, Dr. Donald Klein, who was the head of the New York State Department of Psychiatry. He did the hypnosis work. And that was appalling. I mean, he'd at that point in his career had helped to solve over 70 cases of child abuse and hit and run and things. So you knew he was an expert and it was real. And when I went under hypnosis, instead of what Dr. Klein and I both thought would happen is I would stop seeing these weird alien figures and start to see the people who had been doing this and maybe identify them. Instead, it all just became crystal clear. And at that point, after that, I told Anne the whole story and she listened to the tape of the hypnosis. And she said, Whitley, this is an absolutely fascinating experience. You should write this down. So I started writing, and that turned into the book Communion. I had no idea the book would do what it did. What it was the beginning of contact. And I didn't know that at the time. I had no idea. I would have, I don't know what I would have done if I'd known that the book was such a huge thing, because it's a history-changing thing now. I mean, it's obviously that's what it is. And, we'll just have to see where it goes. But here it is over 30 years later. And look where I am. I've written many books about it since. And, it could be a fundamental change in history that's coming. It's beginning to look more and more like that every day.
Well, you're officially in the history books. Back when these experiences began, and from the book Communion and the movie, my impression was you were more of a victim than a participant. And then in your second book, Transformation, released a year later in 1988, you underwent a fundamental paradigm shift in your perception of what was going on. And there's an old saying that goes, change the way you look at things, and the things you look at change. Is that what happened in your case, that you adapted to the experiences by forcing yourself to look at what was going on in an entirely different perspective?
Well, that's really a very good way of putting it. That was I'll tell you what happened. When I realized that this was something unknown, to this day, I wouldn't tell you that I think it's aliens. I do think they are something unknown. And I don't think we have yet enough knowledge of them, at least not in the public space, to be sure of anything. But I decided that, my God, they're real. They are real. That happened. It wasn't a dream and it wasn't a hallucination or anything. It was an actual physical event. And so I got really curious. You talk about curiosity killed the cat. It didn't kill this cat, but it could have, I think. Because what I started to do was I started to go out into the woods in the middle of the night to the same place where I thought that they had taken me up, to signal to them that, yeah, I'd figured something out. I knew they were real and they were there, and I wanted to know more. And there was a response, a big response. They entered my life. And that's the second book, Transformation, is about that transformation in me from being a victim to being a searcher, really, curious searcher trying to understand what they were and how to relate to them and what they could offer, if anything.
Now, something that I have mused about often is the other dimension aspect to your experiences and others who have gone through abduction like episodes. And I often wonder if the visitors either originate from another dimension or originate in this dimension, but have such high knowledge of exotic physics that they use another dimension for interstellar travel through wormholes and or portals, and hiding their presence out of the phase of our reality. Can you tell us your thoughts and perspectives on these possibilities?
They have extraordinary knowledge. When we see things like the Tic Tac UFO and the gimbal UFO that the government has now admitted are not ours and not anybody's, in fact, then you know that this is incredible. And because you can see by the way they function that they are not, for example, airborne. They're not, they are not flying. They are being held aloft by something else. They have incredible capacities to accelerate and decelerate, to split into two pieces, to go underwater and come out again. They're remarkable. That means that it could be all of the above. In other words, if they have mastered physics the way it appears that they have, then their presence in the world isn't, you're not going to locate it and say, oh, it's another planet, it's a parallel universe, it's this, it's that. Their presence in the world is wherever they want it to be, and they are whatever they wish to be. This reality is their toy.
Talking about the gimbal, the Tic Tac, and the Go Fast, were these things you were familiar with already as being technology of the visitors you have encountered, or do you think they are technologies of another human species, non-human species?
Well, you sort of had a slip of the tongue there that's very interesting to me, because I'm not sure they're not human. I think that, let me tell you what I mean. If you look at many species on this planet, like caterpillars and butterflies are a perfect example. How could a caterpillar, or for that matter, a butterfly, ever believe that the other one was actually him in another form? Or tadpoles and frogs, and it goes on. There's quite a few different species like that. What if we're such a species, and we're one form, and these so-called aliens are another form of human being? That might be why they're here, and it might be why also they are so concerned about our survival, because they certainly are. They are very concerned about nuclear weapons. If you go, you can find many substantiated stories about their visiting nuclear weapons facilities around the world, number one. And number two, they are very concerned about the environment. That is the central message of the whole close encounter community, that the environment is in trouble and it's up to us to fix it. Why not them? Why isn't it up to them? Maybe because they are us in some very strange way that we cannot ever understand any more than a caterpillar can understand that he's going to turn into a butterfly.
So, would you at this point, given what you just said about them possibly being another variation of us, to be able to confidently express the opinion that the visitors have been interacting with our species since vastly ancient times?
Well, if that's true, if they are another version of us, then they've been interacting with us for a very long time, for sure. But one of the things I think, one of the problems we have is that there is a huge disconnect between our academic community and our scientific community and all of this material, because these communities do not want to study this. And because on an individual basis, if you set out to study this, you're going to be ostracized. And the community, or you're not going to be able to get grant money for the studies. So the community is kind of behindhand. However, if the academic community were to re-examine our whole past, all of our mythology, especially the mythology, we might find some, in the context of the fact that, of the idea that what people were reporting might have been in some way real. In other words, the ancient gods weren't just dreamed up. There was something there, et cetera, and so forth. If they were to do that, the results might be quite surprising. And the same is true of, for example, genetic science. We've never made a really serious effort to find out if there have been interventions in the human genetic code that could not be understood. And the reason we haven't is because that would mean aliens or something like that, and you get back to the community not wanting to study that. We do need, in view of the fact that the government has admitted that these UFOs are real and that their origin is unknown and they're not ours, it's time to look back across our whole history on a number of different levels to try to re-examine this and find out an answer to your question, because we don't have one right now.
And while we're on the topic of all of this, you've mentioned that the book Skinwalkers at the Pentagon is one of the most important UFO books ever written. Now, both the ideas of other dimensions and ancient civilizations have been speculated upon as being the main sources of the strange things going on at the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. Can you share with us your thoughts on the paranormal and UFO-related activity at the ranch? From your experiences and interactions over the years, have you any insights or theories that could answer the questions of what is going on there?
Well, first of all, I've never been invited to the ranch. And if I was invited to go to the ranch, I'm not absolutely certain that I would go. Because, it's fine to have this in my life, which I do, but I'm not necessarily going to plunge a stick into the ant nest. Now, I would think that there are places on the planet that apparently where the veil between the worlds, if you want to call it that, is thinner for some reason. And that must be one of them. I have known Colm Kelleher, and George Knapp, who wrote that book for years, both of them, and they're very straight ahead guys. I mean, they're not liars. And the Skinwalker Ranch has been studied so carefully and so extensively for so many years there's little room for doubt that extremely strange things do happen there. The reason I said the book was so important is that the book reveals the level of interest within places like the Defense Intelligence Agency about this whole subject, and an awareness and an acknowledgement that these ultra high strangeness events really do happen, that on an official level. And I think it's, in its many ways, it is going to lead into more disclosure of what the government has actually learned about this, which is probably considerably more than they have told us. And I would think we need to be told. I really would think that. I don't think they have a final solution, but I do think that they have more information that needs to come out.
I completely agree with you. But I think the biggest thing is, disclosure comes from the public instead of the government. And it's been 37 years since your first encounter with the visitors. Your perception on them, on the paranormal, and life after death has evolved considerably since that initial encounter. Knowing now as opposed to what you knew then, can you touch on some of those paradigm shifts you went through, the major ones that turned your life right around?
Yeah. My wife, Anne, was a major figure in all of this. She was the one who said the book should be called Communion, not Body Terror, which is what I was going to call it. And she said that because she said, Whitley, this is what it's about. It's about a new way of living, and it is about a way of finding our way with whatever they are. That would be communion. And then about, I guess it was somewhere in late 1988 or early 1989, and we were getting thousands upon thousands of letters very unexpectedly from around the world, from people who had had similar experiences. In fact, those letters are now collected in an archive at Rice University known as the Archive of the Impossible, which appears isn't impossible at all. But anyway, she came out of her office and she said, Whitley, this has something to do with what we call death. And the reason she said that was that many of these letters involved contact with the dead, and as well as apparent aliens. In other words, the two things would happen at the same time. And to give you an example, it actually would happen like that at our cabin in upstate New York. Anne was quite uncanny. I mean, she was a very sweet gal. I mean, she didn't have anything in her past that would suggest that she had occult or paranormal abilities or anything but, in fact. But she could decide who to bring up to the cabin from the letters we got, people who would have experiences there. And they did have those experiences. And we always knew that the visitors would show up because people would start to see dead friends and relatives beforehand. Like an example, Anne's secretary, Lori Barnes, who she had found in the letters, like she found all of these people. She was at the cabin and with a number of other people. She was walking on the road in front of the cabin, and suddenly her brother was there. And she said to her brother, my God, where have you been? Come down and meet my friends. And he said, I'm just here to tell you I'm all right. And he sort of drifted back into the woods and disappeared. He had disappeared 20 years before, and the FBI had given up the search for him. And no one to this day knows what happened to him. But as soon as Lori came sort of staggering back from her walk and said to me very quietly, the visitors will be here tonight. And they were. And we tried, as we tried every time they came, to get some kind of video. In fact, this house is full of video systems. It's got two systems in it. It's Simply Safe and Nest, both side by side. And I'll tell you, when the visitors come in here, and I think they do come in here from time to time, although I must admit I don't see them, the cameras turn themselves off for some reason. So, uh, and it's not in the software anywhere. And it's both systems at the same time. So
You
there you have it.
mentioned it's a wild story, and something that I want to pick at is you mentioned based off the letters you would decide who could enter the cabin, and those that did, when right before encountering the visitors they would see dead relatives. What do
Yeah.
you think is the connection between the two?
Well,
Why is that happening?
that's an incredibly good question. That's what Anne said. She said it has something to do with what we call death. But what? That's another question, isn't it? We don't know what, but it's just something to do with what we call death. Because the dead, well, I'll give you another example. Here's the situation. A family is living in the wife and husband are sitting in front of the fire. It's about 10 o'clock at night. Their old dog is asleep in front of the fireplace. He's had his walk and he's out for the night. Their little 7-year-old boy is upstairs in bed. The following things happen. First, the dog suddenly becomes extremely nervous, very uncharacteristically, and wants to go out. So the wife takes the dog out. As she opens the front door, she sees a ball of light go racing past over the house and across the horizon. Her husband is in the FAA, and she calls back to him, I just saw a plane going in on fire. You're going to get a call in a minute, because he would be called to such an accident. At that moment, their little 7-year-old son comes running downstairs saying, Mommy, Daddy, Billy was in my room with these little blue men, and he said to tell you he was all right. Now, Billy was his older brother who had died in a car accident the week before. The little blue men were familiar to me because I've seen them. And this man had just moved heaven and earth to get a hold of me, because in those days you couldn't get easily contacted. There was no internet. He had finally found me through my agency, my literary agency, and I called him because I figured someone trying that hard has to be desperate. And he said to me, I just want to know if I have any reason whatsoever to believe my little boy. And I could tell him, yes, you do. We have lots of letters that describe very similar things.
If you could go back in time to those early days of your initial encounters with the visitors, what would you tell yourself?
I would tell myself, don't be as scared as you are, but be careful. Because I was so scared. I was almost like when I first started going out in the woods at night, that was just about the hardest thing I can remember ever doing in my life. It was so difficult to put one foot in front of the other. And then they showed up, actually physically showed up again. And I botched it. I was too scared to go and be with them. And then it happened another time, and I was still too scared. I couldn't do it. And I wish I had done that. I wish I had managed to do it. I think this might be a very different world if I had.
But you also said to be careful. Be careful with what?
Well, I mean, look what happened to me. I was raped. Semen was taken from my body. Thousands of other people, men and women, had similar experiences back in those days. It doesn't happen much now, but it did at first. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you have to be aware of things like that. You have to be very aware of it and very serious about it. And you do have to be careful.
Well, looking at the way the UFO mystery has been covered in recent years, and especially the several months at the beginning of this year with daily hype in the news, interviews, and debates on the government's public interest in handling on the of the military pilot sightings, the preliminary UAP report, etc., do you see a light at the end of the tunnel in regards to more transparency on the topic? And if so, where do you think things are headed?
Well, if the Christian Gillibrand amendment goes through, that is an amendment that to the, I believe, the budget bill, that there will be an organization set up within the government to be a central clearinghouse for all of this stuff. Because right now, each agency keeps its own secrets. And some of those secrets are probably very provocative. Like, it's fairly obvious that the Air Force had a shooting war with these things back in the 50s, and a lot of planes were lost. And then they went out of the business entirely in the 60s on the surface, but didn't actually do that. And they've been saying for all those years that it was nothing, that it's all nonsense. And we have to get past that. We have to get past all of that. And the parts that are hard, like what were the abductions about? Why was sexual material taken from people? What did that mean? Where is it? Were there children created, or what was done with it? We have to, if they know that or anything about that, the public needs to be told. We need to be included. And I think that that's where this is moving, by little tiny steps that are going to get bigger and bigger. Because at the same time, you notice the planet's in real trouble. The planet is changing, and your generation is going to face the consequences of what my generation won't do. And because, we're right now, we've got this big climate thing that went on, but it's not enough. And the Chinese are probably not going to, and the Indians are not going to be very helpful anyway. And the Russians can't, whether they want to or not, because their country's too disorganized. So we're going to suffer the full effects of climate change. And along with that, I think this disclosure process is going to continue. And I hope that there will be some kind of connection between us and whatever this phenomenon is. Because like we were saying before, they have a terrific knowledge of physics. And even if they're part of us, we're sort of schizophrenic now, if that's the case, and we need to come together. Otherwise, we lose our planet in your generation. And I am just horrified about that. I have grandkids. I have kids in your age group, and I love you kids very much. And I don't want to see this happen to you.
No, that's very scary, and this is a very scary time altogether. But yet it's also exciting because we're seeing the ball moving when it comes to the
Yeah.
UAP topic. And it's interesting that you mentioned the shooting war with the UFOs in the 50s, because I interviewed a South Korean UFO researcher for my last show, and he covered several such instances of the same thing happening over Korea by both Korean and American jets during the 50s. So there's something weird about that. I don't know what it is. So, do you have any insights from the visitors or other entities you have encountered in regards to just how many other intelligent species are interacting with humans and this planet?
It's not a question I can answer, because that's a bridge too far for me. That gets into the folklore. What happens in the human mind is this: when we see an unknown phenomenon, we look through our inventory of known phenomena, and we try to connect them. And in the past, we probably connected I call the visitors now, with the fairy folk of the Middle Ages, or with the sylphs and demons of earlier times and the gods. But now we connect them more with a sort of science fiction version of it, which is aliens. I don't think we've ever known what it is. And I think that it may become more clear soon. I don't think the government knows what it is either. I think they have ideas, but I'm pretty sure it would be a different world if they were certain of where they stood. And the reason I say that is the National Security Act forbids, for example, the Air Force from releasing information about anything that may be a threat, but they can't decide whether or not it's a threat. And that's why that document that was released a few months ago was called a threat assessment. And I think that what's going to happen is the government is going to say it's not a threat. And when it says that officially, all of the secrecy that now surrounds it legally ends. It no longer can be kept hidden. It will be, a lot of it. Anyway, that's the way things go in this government, in this country. But it shouldn't be, and a lot will be released over time, I think.
Well, I know you said that it's a bridge too far to look at the question of how many other civilizations could be visiting us, but this leads me to another question, and that is the disruptive interactions of UFOs with sensitive nuclear facilities around the world, both military and power generating corporate installations. Do you have any insights if the intelligences behind these events at nuclear facilities are the same as the visitors that you are familiar with?
Well, once again, I can't draw those kind of connections. Like I don't want to assume that it's aliens from another planet. A lot of people come on your show and tell you about the reptilians and the grays and the fights they're having and all of this, and we don't know if that's true or not. We have no idea. So we're just connecting dots we shouldn't connect. However, there have been numerous events, documented events, at nuclear facilities around the world. And it doesn't take any stretch of the imagination to realize that nuclear weapons and nuclear materials are terribly dangerous. I mean, look at Chernobyl and what happened to this world. And now it looks like the Chinese have invented a weapon so lethal that it can generate a surprise attack, a hypersonic weapon that moves so fast and so low to the ground that there's no way to even anticipate it. You could have a surprise attack where the whole place blows up without warning. And, that's incredibly destabilizing. It could mean that we're going to end up in a situation in the near future like what we were in when World War I started. Nobody understood in July of 1914 that the various maneuvers that were taking place between the great powers would end up in a general war. But then a few weeks later, the worst war that had ever been known was being fought. We could end up in a situation where another war is fought instantaneously. And it's so destabilizing. Of course, they're concerned about it because it tells me something about them. They are concerned about us. No matter what anyone says, they have to be. And they've warned us about these nuclear facilities. And I would expect that the Chinese are going to get warnings as well, unless they've given up on us. I mean, the visitors, which is always a possibility that I very much fear, that they decide, well, it's a hopeless case, let's go home, if this is not their home.
I mean, yes, it's all really anecdotal when it comes to reptilians or other alleged alien types. So, focusing on the visitors you are familiar with, some researchers have speculated that the first nuclear test detonations conducted in the mid-1940s caught the attention of non-human entities, while others have theorized that the test explosions negatively affected other dimensions and the entities occupying them. And they have been coming here since and interfering with other systems. Have you ever been given the insights into this by the visitors and their interactions with nuclear facilities? And if not, what are your thoughts on all of it?
Well, first of all, it's very difficult to communicate with them. It's not like it's not like sitting across a table or being in a classroom or anything. It's very difficult in the sense that it's all in the mind, it's all telepathic, and we get mixed up with our imagination very easily. That's what all of these stories about these anecdotal or verifiable stories. That's where they all come from. I think that if they are enough concerned about us and things get to the point, something close to a point of no return, there may be intervention of some kind. It won't be intervention it'll be asymmetric by our standards, undoubtedly. But I think that could definitely happen. As to what it may be, God knows, but I think that the balance of power right now, as we speak, is being very dangerously changed by what the Chinese have done. And at some point, it's possible there could be some kind of an intervention. And now after World War II, there was an attempt to communicate with us. After all, that's what all those UFO things that happened in the 50s were about, I'm sure. But it didn't work very well, did it? Because we went after them with guns. There's not many instances of them shooting first, and a lot of incidences of them defending themselves. But I don't think that I have any information that I could really give you, that I could put my finger on, about them tearing a hole in nuclear weapons, tearing a hole in reality or any of that stuff. I don't know. But I do know this. There's been enough display, if you will, in the context of nuclear facilities of various kinds to indicate that the visitors are concerned about them. And they've retargeted missiles and things like that, shut them down. And that would indicate the level of concern. But as far as the other stuff I can't answer the question.
And that's totally okay. But regardless, you've been in this field for quite a long time and you've been keeping an eye out on a lot of things. In June of this year, you wrote an article entitled, "What's the Big Deal? The Pentagon admitted UFOs are not of this world 74 years ago." In that article, you mentioned the astronaut, the late Gordan Cooper, taking a photo of a UFO that landed at Edwards Air Force Base in 1957. Gordan described the UFO in detail to you personally.
Yes.
Can you share with us his description of the craft?
Sure.
And if you know if it was piloted by the visitors that you are familiar with?
Gordan didn't mention anything about pilots. If he saw any creatures, he didn't mention that to me. But he's talked about it elsewhere. It wasn't private. So he may have mentioned that to someone else. But what he told me was that what he had seen at the end of a runway was a silver disc, a round silver thing, very bright silver, with tripod legs on it that was sitting on the runway, on the end of the runway. And he took photographs of it and sent them on to Washington and never heard a thing about them again. They, knowing the Air Force, they may have just been destroyed, but they may still exist. I don't know. But he was adamant about it. He saw it, and he was no liar and no dissembler. It happened. Gordan saw that. He did get the pictures, just as he said.
And with all of this, do you think that our modern society is ready to handle the truth about the visitors and about our place in the cosmic scheme of things?
Well, it depends on what the truth about the visitors is and what our place in the cosmic scheme of things is. If we're a simulation of some kind, that's going to be hard to handle. If we are fundamentally inferior in some way, like we're chimpanzees to their humans, that's going to be hard to handle too. If we discover we can't understand as they do, that will be very hard for us. If it turns out that they have their own reasons for being here and they are exploiting us in some way and there's nothing we can do about it, that's going to be hard too. I don't think any of those things are true, because if they were true, why wouldn't they just completely keep themselves hidden, which they could do, undoubtedly. But they don't. Instead, we have this theater unfolding in the skies, and that's what it is. All these UFO sightings are a theater in the sky. And the abductions and the contact experience and the experience many people like me are in, where we've evolved from an abduction to a relationship, that's not something that's something that goes somewhere. It has a locomotion, and the locomotion ends with a viable relationship. So that's what I think they're after. And if we were not intelligent enough or capable enough to sustain our side of it, why would they bother? But they do bother. Therefore, we are capable of doing it. It's just a question of getting us to settle down, which is not easy. But there was a little island in the Andaman Islands that after the tsunami, this island is kept isolated by the Indian government because the islanders have had very little contact with the outside world, and their innocence is considered precious. So the government sent a helicopter to circle the island and see if these people were all right. And what happened was one of the warriors came rushing out onto the beach and started tossing spears at the helicopter. That's us. We're tossing spears at the helicopter on a massive scale. And we need to calm down and say to ourselves, they've been here all this time. We're still here. They haven't done anything to destroy us. This is not an invasion. Something else is happening. I'm not saying it's not dangerous, because there's elements of it that obviously are dangerous. But it is something that we can work with, undoubtedly. And they can too. And they want to. Something is on offer to mankind. And it's time for us to stop playing games. By playing games, I mean scientists and the academics pretending it's all nonsense, or people taking leaps of fantasy into ideas about what they are, where they're from, who they are, blah, blah, blah. And we have to, I think, re-embrace something that something that my wife lived by. That's a very powerful idea. She used to say, the human species is too young to have beliefs. What we need are good questions. And that is the essential truth of our relationship with the visitors now. Let's stop playing games and start asking good questions.
What would be a good question to ask?
What would be a good question to ask? Well, the first question I think we should ask is, how in the world do those devices work? Because if we understood that, it would revolutionize this world. Because beyond the understanding of the device's propulsion system is an understanding of gravity. And an understanding of gravity leads to a fundamental understanding of what reality is.
Where can people find you online, or your books?
Well, they can find me on unknowncountry.com, and it's a big website, and it's specifically for people who are interested in this. It is not full of a bunch of imagination. It's very serious. And my books are available on Amazon for the most part. They're I don't think they sell them in bookstores because Whitley Strieber is too far out for most booksellers, but you can get them on Amazon.
Thank you so much, Whitley.
Thank you.
And we are here with my extra special guest, Mr. Whitley Strieber. Thank you so much for joining me here today once again. And switching gears a little bit from the first half of the show, your perspective on the afterlife has continually evolved as well, given the encounters with loved ones, along with encounters with the visitors, and especially more so with the passing over your beloved Anne. Can you share with us your insights on this? Just what can we expect to find when you leave this realm based off of your understanding and experiences?
Well, Anne became an expert on the afterlife, first because of what was happening with the communion letters and her realization that their dead were somehow involved. I mean, I have to admit that when we started out, I would have told you that there was no afterlife and there were no aliens here or anything like that. Now I have a completely different vision of it. And it started with Anne's observations. Then Anne had, in 2004, a massive cerebral hemorrhage and nearly died and had a near-death experience. After that, she was no longer afraid of dying. Then in 2013, she got brain cancer, and it was terminal. And she, in January of 2015, she said, "Whitley, I'm finished." And in January of 2015, she said she began wanting me to memorize a certain poem called Song of the Wandering Aengus by W.B. Yeats, because she was already planning what would happen in the future. Then in August of that year, in late July of that year, she said, "Whitley, I'm leaving, I'm finished." Because she was having one stroke after another, and her brain was essentially collapsing, and it was over. And so she said, "I want to die a conscious death." And we got hospice in, and they were very helpful in making sure she had just enough morphine to remain comfortable, but not so much that she would fall asleep until her body did so naturally. And then after she passed away, about an hour and a half later, I got a call from a friend of ours. I was sitting in the living room in terrible grief. And the friend said, "Whitley, I just heard Anne's voice in my head say, 'Call Whitley.'" And I was saying in my mind at the time, "Annie, if you still exist, please give me some kind of a sign." And over the next 2 weeks, this happened again and again and again with other friends. And eventually I vaguely recalled a moment when we were discussing this as after it had become obvious that the dead were somehow involved in the communion experience. And we'd said that if the first of us to die would, if possible, contact friends and tell them to call the other one or to tell the other one, because neither one of us would ever believe it if we heard that ourselves in our own head. We'd think it was our imagination. We never told anybody about this. In fact, I pretty much forgot about it. And then she started doing it. And I thought, oh my God, there is an afterlife. And that was the beginning of the book, The Afterlife Revolution, because we became close confidants and we worked together across the bridge between the worlds, to the extent that I wear both rings now to symbolize the fact that we've got one body left, but there's still two of us doing this.
That's really adorable.
Just
to change gears a little bit, you mentioned during the main show that our planet is in trouble and that my generation may be facing cataclysms very soon. And you wrote the book The Day After Tomorrow, which focused on the shutting down of the Atlantic Gulf Current. what should I be doing? What should we be doing as young people to do our part in changing this direction? Or do you think we need a global intervention from the visitors to really sway the power away from the corporations and government back to the people?
We need a global intervention, all right, but it's not necessarily from the visitors. It's from you guys, from the young people. This is your world. You need to take political action, every single one of you. When you find a climate change denier, you need to go on the attack because they are saying, let's die. And that is not what your plan of life is, or you wouldn't even be here. There's a death wish out there somewhere. And I don't know how else to explain it, because any fool can see what's happening to the climate. And yet there are, as soon as, like in this country, we went to a big climate forum 2 years ago with another administration. We were denying that climate change existed at all, and tearing down every effort that had been made in previous years to save ourselves. You have to fight for yourselves, for your own lives. And this is a fight for the life of mankind, and that means you.
If you enjoy the strange and the mysterious, UFOs, the paranormal, and cryptids, this channel is for you. So make sure to subscribe, as I do 3 videos right here every single week, and hit that notification bell so you do not miss any of the bonus content I post right here.